Trump's tariff war has been paused. While China did not explicitly respond to the US's unreasonable demands and chose to face the trade war head-on, Canada and Mexico, by actively responding to Trump's demands, secured a one-month buffer period. At the same time, the US has also issued threats to the UK and the EU. However, major EU countries like France and Germany have taken a tough stance, believing that Europe has ways to counter the US's tariff threats. So, does Europe really have the strength to resist the US? In this video, we briefly discuss this topic. In fact, around 2008, Europe was still in its golden age, with a GDP more than 3 times that of China and higher than that of the US. However, the US launched a series of attacks on Europe, such as instigating the Arab Spring, creating a refugee influx into Europe, and causing severe social unrest. For example, the US targeted major European companies like Alstom, forcing them to withdraw from competition with US firms in key sectors. The US also continuously attacked and shorted the euro, downgrading it from a world reserve currency on par with the US dollar to a marginal player. Now, with the UK leaving the EU, the economic output of the Eurozone is lower than that of China and far behind the US. Coupled with serious internal divisions within the EU and the massive political and energy crises caused by the Ukraine war, the EU has long lost its standing to engage in equal dialogue with the US and China. In areas critical to productivity transformation, such as chip manufacturing and AI, Europe has gradually lost its voice and become a marginal player. Many people wonder why Europe has not mounted a strong counterattack in the face of continuous US pressure. If Europe was unable to resist US plunder during its peak, does it still have the capacity to resist Trump's tariff threats now? The final answer is simple. Europe has no ability to resist the US and can only hope that the US's slaps are lighter. During the EU's peak, Europe had the full capacity to confront the US head-on. However, the US successfully divided Europe through its agent, the UK. At the same time, the US cultivated a large number of interest representatives in Europe, such as Ursula von der Leyen and a host of European politicians who speak fluent English. Ironically, although the UK has left the EU and the US is not an EU member, English remains the de facto working language of the European Parliament. As is well known, after the 2008 Beijing Olympics, China's economy rapidly developed under large-scale stimulus policies, with annual growth rates exceeding double digits, a pace that was truly astonishing. China's total economic output soon became the second largest in the world, second only to the US. By 2014, China's economy, calculated by purchasing power parity, became the largest in the world. However, during the same period, the US was focusing its efforts on attacking the EU. A series of US foreign policies were centered around undermining the EU and the euro. But to make Europeans comply with US strategic arrangements, the US cleverly used ideology as a weapon. The US instigated the Arab Spring in the Middle East under the banner of freedom and democracy, overthrowing numerous regimes to create refugees and disrupt European society. What is terrifying is that European politicians not only failed to resist US actions, but also sent troops to help the US attack Middle Eastern countries. After the refugee crisis emerged, the US took no responsibility, leaving European leftists to uphold political correctness and accept large numbers of Middle Eastern refugees. The US was able to do this because its tech giants had already controlled Europeans' access to information. US tech products like Google, Facebook, Twitter, and YouTube dominate the entire Western world. Other countries, due to their insufficient economic scale, cannot produce software that competes with US products and must rely on US tech as infrastructure to develop their own internet ecosystems. Using US products inevitably means accepting US dominance in public opinion. No matter how shameless the US government's actions are, no matter how much the US harms European interests, these social media platforms steadfastly maintain the US's image of justice, attributing disasters in Europe and the Middle East to Russia, China, and Islamic countries. The 2014 Crimea crisis was orchestrated by the U.S. government. Cornered, Russia annexed Crimea and then instigated the independence of eastern Ukraine, ultimately leading to the prolonged and brutal Ukraine war. Europe failed to realize that keeping Europe and Russia in a state of hostility is a key U.S. strategy to weaken Europe. Through the Ukraine war, the U.S. completely cut off Europe's access to cheap Russian energy, severely damaging European manufacturing. At the same time, the U.S. sold high-priced energy to Europe, boosting its own energy industry. European countries paid a real economic price and also had to bear the burden of substantial aid to Ukraine. Meanwhile, the U.S., after achieving its goals, changed presidents and began preparing to abandon Ukraine, demanding that Europe take on the responsibility of defending against Russia, increase military spending, and buy more U.S. weapons. This shameless approach was strongly supported by U.S. interest representatives like von der Leyen. Although right-wing forces in Europe are beginning to push back. For example, Germany's AfD has explicitly demanded von der Leyen's resignation and called for Germany to break free from the EU and U.S. constraints to pursue an independent foreign policy. The U.S.'s decades-long strategic layout in Europe means that, in the short term, Europe will continue to play the role of a U.S. vassal. In this context, if the U.S. launches a trade war against Europe, it will be difficult for Europe to form a unified response, and the most likely outcome is capitulation. Many countries may even fear that delaying surrender will result in harsher U.S. retaliation, potentially leading to a race to capitulate to the U.S. The same logic applies to traditional U.S. allies like Canada, Australia, and New Zealand. These countries have long treated U.S. tech industries as the foundation of their own tech sectors, heavily relying on U.S. chips, operating systems, social media, AI, and Starlink. At the same time, due to their inability to achieve economies of scale, their markets exist as appendages to the U.S. market. When the U.S. decides to extract wealth, they can only comply and pay protection money. Trump's approach may seem no different from that of a rogue gangster, but in reality, it aims to establish a global interest distribution system dominated by the U.S. In the future, besides following market rules, America first will become an unbreakable rule. For example, in Panama, Trump doesn't really care who operates the canal. What matters to him is the Panamanian government's obedience to the U.S. Panama's withdrawal from the Belt and Road Initiative will not bring any compensatory benefits from the U.S., but this is the price of survival under the U.S.'s watchful eye. Similarly, Trump doesn't care if Canada and Mexico make money from the U.S. After all, the U.S. dollar is just paper they print. His goal in dealing with these countries is to ensure they fully comply with U.S. demands on major policies related to the economy, diplomacy, and defense. However, as I have repeatedly mentioned, the U.S. government's aggressive behavior does not signify its strength but rather its decline. In the past, following the U.S. was driven by values and interests. Aligning with U.S. values meant prosperity, and binding policies to the U.S. meant reaping benefits. Now, U.S. allies are forced to sacrifice their own interests under the threat of U.S. coercion, driven not by benefits but by the fear of being beaten by the U.S. Such an international order cannot last. As soon as the U.S. falls behind in its competition with China, or even if it simply fails to quickly defeat China, it will face isolation and abandonment by its allies. In the past, politicians could ban a tech product simply by claiming it came from China. But in the future, as resentment toward U.S. hegemony grows, politicians will need to provide concrete reasons to discredit Chinese tech. This is because it is increasingly clear that using U.S. tech carries higher risks. For many third-world countries, they will also come to understand that if forced to choose between China and the U.S., the risks of choosing the U.S. far outweigh those of choosing China.